All around the world as of 2024, it's been estimated that the US military runs somewhere around 750 bases overseas beyond the sovereign territory of the United States itself, across about 80 or more different foreign countries that span every continent on the Earth, including Antarctica. There are so many American military bases in so many places, and so many more are getting built or getting withdrawn from all the time, and so many more are just top secret and not public knowledge, that nobody even really knows exactly how many there are around the world at any given time. Not even the Pentagon itself, apparently. Because of this, the number usually given for how many overseas American military bases there are is around 750, with all of the known ones that exist today marked on this map that you see now stretched all across the world. America's global military machine is so all-encompassing today that it literally runs more overseas military bases than every single other country in the world does by several times over. Roughly 75 to 85% of all the overseas military bases run by all the countries in the world today are exclusively run by the United States, meaning that no other country's military runs anywhere near as comparable a global footprint as America's. At any given time, there will be around 170,000 active-duty American soldiers deployed overseas to these hundreds of bases around the world, which is roughly comparable to the entire size of the German military, but all deployed beyond its own borders. The US almost certainly controls more manned military outposts around the world today than any previous people, nation, or empire before it has in all of human history, which, along with America's technological advantages and massive budget, make the US military the most formidable armed force that has ever existed in our planet's history. But rather than America's technological, manpower, or financial advantages, it is primarily the US military's logistical capabilities between all of these 750 or so bases around the world that make the American military so globally dominant and really impossible to challenge. The US military takes logistics so seriously that within only a couple of years of invading the landlocked country of Afghanistan on the other side of the world in the middle of Central Asia, and after overthrowing the Taliban government there, the Air Force flew in a fully operational mobile Burger King to feed the American soldiers fighting there in the middle of hostile territory. And within time, the US military had a fully operational Pizza Hut and Dairy Queen set up within the middle of Afghanistan as well. But nearly everywhere they're located, America's hundreds of military bases are also becoming increasingly controversial, both within the countries where they're located and back at home within the United States itself. America's hundreds of overseas military bases can be broadly divided into two separate categories. There are larger, more often permanently installed military bases that house more than 200 troops and typically cost more than $10 million to build, and which represent about 60% of America's worldwide military bases. And then there are smaller, more often less permanent military bases that are referred to as cooperative security locations, or lily pads, that are set up to be less intrusive, less obvious forward operating sites that typically cost less than $10 million to get set up, and have fewer than 200 military personnel staffed within them, which represent the remaining 40% of America's overseas bases worldwide. And all across the world, there are some parts of it that have significantly higher concentrations of US military bases than others do. There are relatively fewer American bases present in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa, and significantly more bases present in Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia. Germany is the country that's presently home to the highest concentration of American military bases and overseas servicemen in the world. A lasting legacy of Germany's crushing defeat during the Second World War, West Germany's geographic position as a frontline state against the Soviet-backed Warsaw Pact during the ensuing Cold War, and the permanent American military presence in the country that has remained ever since. At the end of the Cold War in 1990, the US had around 250,000 troops stationed all across Europe. But after the Soviet Union disintegrated, the Clinton administration began shutting down dozens of bases on the continent and greatly reduced America's total troop presence there by more than half. By 2021, with Europe having remained fairly calm for decades and major crises having exploded elsewhere that distracted America's military attention to other continents, US troop levels on the European continent had dwindled down to fewer than 64,000, with about half of that total being concentrated in Germany. But since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine was launched the following year in 2022, Washington has begun surging tens of thousands of troops back to Europe once again, to the point where today there are around 100,000 American troops deployed to the continent, with about 54,000 of them all being deployed to America's various bases in Germany, and tens of thousands of others deployed to bases across Italy, the UK, Poland, Spain, Romania, Kosovo, and elsewhere. But by far America's single largest and most important permanently installed base in Europe is Ramstein Air Base here in Western Germany. the headquarters for the U.S. Air Force in Europe that serves as the anchor for a sprawling American military complex that houses 54,000 American soldiers and more than 5,400 American civilian employees. Ramstein is therefore featured very prominently in America's overseas military operations all throughout its history, serving as a major logistical center for U.S. aircraft flying from the mainland to pursue operations in Africa and the Middle East. The Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, located just outside of Ramstein, is the largest American military hospital outside of the U.S. itself, that was used extensively throughout the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to treat wounded American soldiers. In 2021, when Afghanistan was evacuated, Ramstein was also used as a major transfer point for thousands of Afghan civilians and soldiers who'd been airlifted out of the country by American aircraft to start new lives in safety in the U.S. mainland. But Ramstein is also not without its many controversies. In 2015, it was revealed that the U.S. was using Ramstein as a logistical operations center to transport weapons and munitions to U.S.-backed rebels in Syria fighting in the civil war there without the knowledge or consent of the German government. While even further, it was revealed in the same year that Ramstein was also being used by the Obama administration as a critically important control center for American drones being used to attack targets in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia. The German government claimed that it was not ever informed about America's usage of Ramstein as a major drone command center, and in 2019, 3 Yemeni citizens who lost family members during a 2012 U.S. drone strike took legal action against the German government for having allowed the operation of the drones on their territory at Ramstein. But since the U.S. has full legal jurisdiction over Ramstein Air Base, Berlin's ability to control what the U.S. actually does on the base, even without the knowledge or consent of the German government, is very limited. And this remains true across many of America's other military bases around the world as well, even in Europe. America's second largest overseas troop concentration in Europe is in Italy, largely based around the headquarters of the U.S. 6th Fleet in Naples and the strategically located naval air station Sigonella, with around 4,000 U.S. troops and their aircraft positioned on Sicily, roughly in the center of the Mediterranean Sea, which serves as one of the primary stopover points for U.S. airlifts and aircraft bound from the continental U.S. towards the Middle East and the Indian Ocean. The U.S. also operates out of a major Air Force base in the north of the country at Aviano, home to the U.S. Air Force's 31st Fighter Wing that is one of only a handful of overseas American military bases that is known to store nuclear weapons in underground storage systems. One of the most controversial incidents concerning the American military in Italy took place in 2003, when CIA agents abducted an Egyptian Islamist cleric named Abu Omar while he was in Milan while he was seeking asylum in Italy. He was then transported by the CIA to the U.S. Air Force Base in Aviano, and then transported to Egypt, where he was imprisoned for 4 years without any charges, secluded, and brutally tortured by the then Mubarak regime. 26 CIA agents operating in Italy at the time were later indicted by Italian prosecutors over the abduction, including the man who was the head of the CIA in Italy at the time, Jeffrey W. Castelli. 10 years later, after the Omar Abu abduction in 2013, Castelli was convicted of 7 years in prison for his role in the incident by an Italian court, along with 3 other CIA officials at the time. But none of them were physically present at the trial, and none of them have ever been extradited by the US government back to Italy to serve out their sentences ever since. The next largest concentration of US forces present in Europe are in the UK, where over 10,000 American troops are permanently based, with the 2 largest concentrations being at the twin RAF bases of Lakenheath and Mildenhall in the southeast of England. The US has maintained a permanent military presence in the UK ever since the Second World War, and despite being officially an RAF station, Lakenheath currently only hosts the US Air Force and their own personnel. And in recent history, these have been the American bases that have been instrumental in supporting US air operations in Libya and elsewhere in the Middle East. In 1986, a bomb blew up in a Berlin disco club that was known to be popular with American soldiers and killed 3 and wounded hundreds of others. The bombing was quickly traced by American intelligence back to Muammar Gaddafi's regime in Libya. And then 9 days after the bombing later, under orders from President Ronald Reagan and with the airspaces of France and Spain all blocked off to them, 24 US fighters took off from Lakenheath Air Base to bomb Libya in a retaliatory strike and carried out the longest fighter combat mission ever attempted in the history of the US Air Force in the process. Conducting a 14-hour round-trip flight, the fighters flew all the way around Europe, through the Strait of Gibraltar, and then across the Mediterranean towards Libya, where they dropped 60 tons of bombs before turning back around and flying the same route back to Lakenheath again, while the US 6th Fleet based in Italy moved in just off of Libya's shores to support the attack. This is how, within a matter of hours of the order being given by the president, the US military machine with its logistical infrastructure already in place abroad can rapidly attack a target in a faraway location like Libya. Decades later, in 2011, US aircraft from Mildenhall and Lakenheath took part in attacking Gaddafi's regime in Libya once again, when they sortied out to enforce a no-fly zone over the country and bombarded Gaddafi's military on the ground during the Libyan civil war, which ultimately resulted in Gaddafi's overthrow and death. The US-run airfields in the UK, like Washington's other military bases in Europe, are therefore a major part of America's global defense strategy, and like the rest of them, they are similarly not without their controversies. One of America's other military bases in the UK is located at RAF Crowdon, which is used by the US Air Force as a major communication station that processes roughly a third of all American military communications in Europe. In 2019, an American woman who was employed at the base and married to one of the base's CIA agents was driving her car near the base on the American side of the road, which, of course, was the wrong side of the road in the UK. As such, she struck and killed a 19-year-old British man named Harry Dunn, who was riding his motorcycle on the correct side of the road. Days after the incident, the American woman fled the country back to the United States and quickly claimed diplomatic immunity for herself, with the support of the US government, where she has remained a free woman ever since, which has all contributed to a tense diplomatic standoff between London and Washington. And the situation isn't very much different over on the other side of the world in East Asia, the other highest concentration of American overseas military bases in the world. After Germany, the next two countries that have the highest concentration of American bases and troops are Japan and South Korea, home to roughly 50,000 and 28,500 American troops and dozens of bases respectively. In fact, the single largest overseas US military base anywhere in the world is at Camp Humphreys here in South Korea. This base is a truly massive complex, costing nearly $11 billion to build, or about half of Brazil's entire annual military budget. It sprawls across roughly 14 square kilometers, or about a quarter the area of Manhattan. There are 500 buildings located within the base that are designed to accommodate a total population of 45,000 Americans, made up of soldiers and their spouses and children. The base is designed to essentially function as an American military town in the middle of South Korea, complete with American-run elementary schools, a middle school, and a high school for the soldiers' children. The base even has a suburban American-looking water park, an American-style gymnasium for children, a movie theater that plays the American editions of films, a massive US post office to facilitate mail deliveries, and a huge food court within an American-style shopping mall that contains American fast food classics like Popeyes, Burger King, Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, Starbucks, and others. It's designed to be as much of a slice of America as possible. That's also home to thousands of American troops and their aircraft that can be rapidly deployed in the event of an emergency nearby with North Korea or China. And while the government of South Korea is more than happy to host them there as a deterrent force against North Korea, their presence has often still been fairly controversial among some local South Korean citizens. Most notably in 2002, a US Army armored vehicle that was returning back to its base on a public road after conducting training exercises out in the countryside hit and killed two 14-year-old South Korean schoolgirls who were walking along the side of the road on the way to a birthday party. Initially, the two US soldiers who were driving the vehicle were charged by the US military in military court with negligent homicide, but the South Korean government sought to transfer the case and try them in South Korean civilian court instead. The US military refused to do so, and the two soldiers were subsequently found as not guilty in the ensuing military-run trial, which sparked huge anti-American protests among several South Koreans across various points in the country. And America's parallel overseas military presence in Japan is arguably even more controversial. The US military, like in European countries, has maintained a permanent presence in Japan since the end of World War II. After Germany, Japan is these days home to the second largest concentration of overseas US forces worldwide. About 50,000 total troops spread out across 85 different bases all across the country, including the headquarters of the US 7th Fleet that includes America's only permanently forward-deployed aircraft carrier at Yokosuka, strategically near to the entrance of Tokyo Bay. But the highest concentration of American forces in Japan for decades have always been within the small, far southern Japanese island of Okinawa. Despite making up only 0.6% of Japan's total land area, 62% of America's military bases in Japan are all concentrated here. The US military maintains a permanent presence of around 30,000 soldiers on Okinawa, which all on its own would be America's second largest overseas deployment of troops in the world, only behind Germany. The small island of Okinawa is also densely populated, with nearly 1.5 million people who live there. And yet, roughly 25% of all the island's land is controlled exclusively by the US military and the 30,000 American troops stationed there. And their presence here is among the most controversial of any of America's overseas deployments worldwide. For a period of 26 years from Japan's surrender in 1945 up until 1971, Okinawa and the rest of the Ryukyu island chain that it's a part of were directly controlled by the United States government itself. During those 26 years of direct American administration on Okinawa, the military recognized Okinawa's highly strategic location as an unsinkable aircraft carrier directly on the edge of the East China Sea, roughly equidistant from major flashpoints in Korea and the Taiwan Strait and relatively nearby to Vietnam. So, dozens of American military bases, airfields, logistics centers, and other facilities were all constructed on the island over the decades that transformed it into America's most geopolitically valuable asset held in East Asia. An asset that has been used as America's primary forward operating base and staging area for the wars in Korea and Vietnam, and as preparation for a potential war against China over the status of Taiwan ever since. After the islands were given back to Japan in 1971, the US just kept all of the military bases and facilities that it had built up on Okinawa over the past 26 years. And so Okinawa therefore continues to remain highly important to the US military's ability to deter and counter threats in the region posed by China and North Korea, which benefits the Japanese government, who doesn't have to worry about those threats as much themselves, while the bases are also far enough away from mainland Japan and most of Japan's citizens that they don't really cause too much controversy outside of Okinawa. But they cause massive controversy within Okinawa. Despite taking up 25% of the island's land, the US military presence on Okinawa only contributes between 4 to 5% of the island's total economy, and restricts 1/4 of the island's land from further economic development or housing for the local Okinawan residents, which has led to Okinawan citizens arguing that they face a disproportionate burden of hosting the US military in Japan, compared to the rest of the country. And probably due to the sheer number of US troops present on the island, all confined within a relatively small place, the crimes that have been committed by US service members on the island have been much more widely reported on than elsewhere. It has been reported that in the 37 years between 1972, right after the US returned the islands to Japan, and 2009, American service members stationed on Okinawa committed a total of 5,634 criminal offenses, including 25 murders, 25 arsons, 385 burglaries, 2,827 thefts, 306 assaults, and other crimes that are too heinous to discuss on YouTube. A Japanese police agency also found that American servicemen on Okinawa were 86% less likely to be convicted of committing a crime by the Japanese government than a local Okinawan resident was. And on top of the crime problem, there's also an environmental contamination problem by the US military on the island as well. Recently, just a few years ago in 2021, the Japanese Ministry of the Environment found that water contamination nearby to the US-run Kadena Air Base on Okinawa had severely contaminated the drinking water supply of 450,000 Okinawan residents with cancer-causing toxic chemicals, which has inflamed tensions between the locals on Okinawa and the US military even further. Outside of East Asia and Europe, the next largest concentration of overseas American military bases today are unsurprisingly in the Middle East. But America's military footprint here in this part of the world is dramatically smaller than it used to be. At its height in 2011, the US had more than 100,000 troops actively deployed across at least 10 bases in Afghanistan alone, while in 2007, the US had nearly 170,000 troops actively deployed to Iraq. About as many US troops that are deployed all around the world everywhere today in 2024. But since those times, the US has greatly winded down its troop presence in the region, preferring to pivot its attention towards the rising threats of China and East Asia and Russia and Europe instead. All American forces have been withdrawn from Afghanistan since 2021, while America's troop presence in Iraq has dwindled down to a much smaller force of only around 2,500 total troops, largely concentrated in just 2 remaining bases in the country that are allowed with the permission of the Iraqi government. These days, the US has only around 30,000 total troops actively deployed across the entire Middle East region, about as many as the US has all concentrated just on the island of Okinawa alone. America's single largest military base in the Middle East today is at Al Udeid Air Base located in Qatar. After the Qatari and American militaries cooperated together in pushing out Saddam's invading army from Kuwait during the 1991 Gulf War, Qatar realized that as a tiny country without its own significant military, it needed a strong outside power to protect itself. And so, the US and Qatar signed a defense cooperation agreement that included the Qataris constructing a secret air base for the Americans to use in the country in 1996 for more than $1 billion. The first time that US forces used Al Udeid in Qatar was in late September of 2001. Just after the 9/11 attacks, when Washington needed the base to position aircraft for its looming air operations in Afghanistan. Since that time, Al Udeid has transformed into a major US military base in the Middle East region, offering a convenient location for American aircraft to position themselves in for operations that have followed in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Al Udeid is therefore a major US airbase, logistics, and command center for the military to use that's positioned roughly in the center of the Persian Gulf region, directly opposite of Iran. It is presently home to roughly 11,000 US troops and multiple strategic bombers like the B-1 Lancer. Al Udeid is therefore home to about a third of all the US troops currently stationed in the Middle East theater, while thousands of other US troops and equipment are based in airfields in the neighboring United Arab Emirates, while the second largest US military presence in the Middle East is centered within the small island kingdom of Bahrain, which hosts the Naval Support Activity Bahrain that's the home port of the US Fifth Fleet, that's responsible for carrying out America's naval interests in the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, and the Red Sea. It is the third of America's fleets that is home ported beyond the sovereign territory of the United States itself, along with the previously mentioned 7th Fleet headquartered in Yokosuka, Japan, with responsibility for covering the Western Pacific and the Eastern Indian Ocean, and the 6th Fleet headquartered in Naples, Italy, with responsibility for covering the Mediterranean, the Western Indian Ocean, and the Eastern Atlantic. The remaining 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Fleets are all headquartered within the United States itself, which together gives the US Navy operating coverage across the entire world. As a result, about 9,000 US troops and Department of Defense employees are based in Bahrain that defend the little kingdom in the dangerous neighborhood of the Middle East, while Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan all host large numbers of US forces on overseas bases as well. And beyond the Arab world, America's other most significant military base in the region is at Incirlik in Turkey, another major air base that also stores America's nuclear weapons in the region, with around 50 American nuclear bombs known to be stored at the base parked nearby within bomber range to Russia and Iran. Incirlik has been used extensively to transport aircraft and troops to the Middle East theater in several of America's previous wars, and most recently was heavily used by the United States in 2015 as a forward-operating drone and attack aircraft base for fighting against ISIS across the border in Iraq and Syria, after they received the green light from the Turkish government hosting the base to do so. And even with only a fraction of the number of troops and amount of equipment based in the Middle East today as compared to a couple of decades ago during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the US military and its worldwide logistical support system is still capable of bearing down devastation on the area against America's enemies at a moment's notice. After a drone attack hit a small US military base in Jordan called Tower 22 just across the border from Syria and Iraq, 3 American soldiers on the base were killed and 47 others were wounded. The attack was linked to Iranian-backed Shiite militias operating in Iraq, and within days, President Biden ordered the military to carry out a retaliatory strike. 2 American B-1 bombers loaded up with 75,000 pounds of munitions each, then took off from the runway at Dyess Air Force Base in Texas on a 44-hour round-trip mission. They flew across the United States to meet up with American aerial refueling tankers just off the coast of Nova Scotia. Then, they continued flying across the Atlantic Ocean, where, just off of the coast of Portugal, they met up with more American aerial refueling tankers that took off from America's military bases in the UK. Then, the bombers continued flying all the way across the Mediterranean towards the Middle East, where they linked up with fighter escorts that departed from America's bases like Al Udeid in Qatar. And then, over a period of only 30 minutes, the bombers dropped more than 125 precision-guided munitions across more than 85 Iran-backed militia targets at 7 different locations throughout Iraq and Syria, reportedly causing devastating damage and dozens of casualties. And then, the bombers just flew back the same way they came, with the aerial refueling supports all the way back to where they took off from in Texas one day previously, without ever landing once, and accomplishing the longest and most complicated bombing raid in American history since the 2003 Iraq War in the process. Overall, most of America's overseas military bases are within generally allied countries where their governments explicitly approve of their presence, even if they don't necessarily know about or approve of everything that goes on within them. But there are some of them that are located within the territories of countries where they are explicitly not welcome, and, as you'd expect, these ones are significantly more controversial than any of the others. Some of these examples include the small military outposts in Syria that the US military runs, where around 900 US soldiers are currently stationed at. The American soldiers here operate in the country without the permission of the Syrian government, and they serve a couple of different roles. Two of America's bases in the northeast of the country are located in the de facto autonomous area that's under the control of the US-backed Syrian Kurdish forces. The US bases here are used to transport weapons and munitions to the Syrian Kurdish forces in Syria, and to train and advise Syrian Kurdish officers, whom the US supports within Syria against the Syrian government and against ISIS. The other US military base in Syria that's there against the Syrian government's permission is in the central south of the country, just across from the international borders with Iraq and Jordan, the Al-Tanf base. This small American outpost in Syria of around 200 soldiers in the middle of the empty Syrian desert has only been around since 2016, and it still serves a very critical function. The Americans declared a 55-kilometer safe zone within Syria's territory around the base's perimeter, and the base itself sits on the highly strategic M2 Baghdad to Damascus highway, one of only 3 major highways that connect Iraq with Syria. The other 2 highways run further north and stretch from Iraq into the northeastern part of Syria that's largely under the de facto control of the US-backed Syrian Kurdish forces, which means that with the US blocking the southern highway with their base in Syria at Al-Tanf, Washington can effectively block off all of the other major highways running from Iraq into Syria, which ultimately means that Washington can block off all of Iran's land corridors that they want to use to transport weapons, munitions, and volunteers to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Which means that the Al-Tanf base is strategically located to support Israel by denying Hezbollah access to its quickest land corridor with Iran. With Turkey generally aligned to the United States and NATO, the Syrian Kurdish forces aligned to the US within Syria, the Al-Tanf base and its 55-kilometer perimeter directly under the control of the US itself, and Jordan aligned to the US military as well, the US has established a nearly continuous north-south corridor of aligned areas that mostly block off Iran's direct access to its proxies and aligned states in the Levant, like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Syrian government. The Al-Tanf base in Syria, while small, is the linchpin in this entire strategy. And, unsurprisingly, the Syrian government flatly rejects their presence and regards the US occupation in the area of Al-Tanf as illegal, a position that has been diplomatically supported by the likes of Russia and China. But America's bases in Syria are far from the only overseas bases that Washington runs in foreign countries that are rejected by their hosting governments. Perhaps the most infamous one of all is Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, the very first overseas military base that the United States ever created all the way back in 1903, after the conclusion of the 1898 Spanish-American War resulted in a brief US military occupation of Cuba. During the US occupation of the island, Washington inserted an amendment into the Cuban Constitution that allowed the US to establish naval bases on land that was leased or purchased from the Cuban government. The US then entered into a lease over the land that would become the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, and the lease agreement they drafted, conveniently, had no expiration date, essentially meaning that the United States would lease the land from Cuba in perpetuity. Cuba would theoretically continue having ultimate sovereignty over the land in the base, but the US government would maintain sole legal jurisdiction over it so long as they leased it. Ever since Cuba's communist revolution in 1959 overthrew the previous government and installed the communist regime in Cuba that we still know today, the Cuban government has continually insisted that America's military presence in Guantanamo Bay is illegal, and that the land and the base should be returned back to the Cuban government. Washington has, naturally, refused all of these demands for more than 65 years now, and continues to cite the terms of the perpetual lease agreement they basically made with themselves over Guantanamo Bay back during the US military occupation of Cuba in 1901. And as per the terms of that agreement, the US has been required to pay the Cuban government a fee of $4,500 a year to continue maintaining their lease to Guantanamo Bay. And so, for the past 65 plus years now, the US government has been continually sending a $4,500 check to the Cuban government every single year that the communist regime on the island has continually refused to accept. And interestingly, due to the decades-long trade embargo that the US government has applied on Cuba, there isn't a single McDonald's anywhere on the entire island of Cuba, except for a single one that is placed within Guantanamo Bay beyond the Cuban government's control, for the base's roughly 8,500 US sailors and Marines to enjoy. And then, after the 9/11 attacks on the US came in 2001, Guantanamo Bay's original purpose as an overseas US naval base in the Caribbean region was transformed when President George W. Bush issued an executive military order that enabled foreign nationals suspected of being involved with the attacks to be arrested and held indefinitely without any charges and without any legal mechanism of challenging their imprisonment. 3 months after the 9/11 attacks in December of 2001, the US Department of Justice rather interestingly claimed that since Guantanamo Bay wasn't really a part of US territory, and was theoretically Cuban land that was only leased to the US government, the principle of habeas corpus, the legal recourse against unlawful detention, did not apply there. As a result, in early 2002, the US military set up a prison camp within Guantanamo Bay to detain hundreds of suspected al-Qaeda members and affiliates and Taliban fighters who had mostly been captured during the US invasion of Afghanistan. Eventually, a total of 780 prisoners from dozens of countries would be detained within the Guantanamo Bay detention camp, with the American government continually claiming that none of the prisoners who were held there were entitled to any basic protections under the US Constitution or the Geneva Convention, since Guantanamo Bay was theoretically outside of sovereign US territory where the Constitution didn't apply, and that all the prisoners held there were supposedly unlawful enemy combatants whom the Geneva Conventions didn't apply to either. Out of all the 780 prisoners who have been held by the US military within Guantanamo Bay since 2002, only 16 of them have ever been formally charged with criminal offenses. As of 2024, the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center continues to remain open and active with 30 prisoners who are still being held there. Among them are some of the most high-value prisoners related to the 9/11 attacks that have been continually held in Guantanamo Bay for decades now, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is believed to have been al-Qaeda's number 3 leader and chief propagandist, who is admitted to masterminding the 9/11 attacks and the previous 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Ramzi bin al-Shibh, who has been alleged to have been a potential 9/11 hijacker candidate, and Abu Zubaydah, who is believed to be a major al-Qaeda courier who transferred messages between Osama bin Laden and other al-Qaeda cells, among various other high-profile al-Qaeda-affiliated detainees. All of these men were captured by the CIA in Pakistan shortly after the 9/11 attacks took place, and each of them were then transferred around a vast and secretive network of CIA-run prisons beyond the reach of the rest of the US government around the world that are known as black sites, before they were eventually transferred to Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. By their very nature, these CIA-run black sites were considered a top state secret of the US government, and their exact locations, to this day, are almost entirely unknown by the general public. Their precise locations were only known by a handful of extremely high-ranking American officials, like the president and senior intelligence officials. But foreign countries that are known to have hosted a CIA black site included Afghanistan, Thailand, Morocco, Romania, Poland, and Lithuania. And besides for those countries, one of the most likely other locations that a CIA black site was hosted at was on this small, remote island in the middle of the Indian Ocean that is home to arguably America's number 1 most controversial overseas military base in the world, Diego Garcia. Diego Garcia is a relatively small, narrow coral island atoll that snakes its way through the Indian Ocean that at first glance appears almost entirely insignificant. At about 33 square kilometers in total area, the island is only about half the size of Manhattan, and is located near nothing but open ocean for thousands of kilometers in every direction. But Diego Garcia is the largest coral atoll in the world, and as such, it's also the largest coral atoll within the greater Chagos archipelago in the Indian Ocean where it's located. And, most importantly, Diego Garcia is located almost precisely in the geographic center of the Indian Ocean, offering whoever controls it a valuable piece of territory for a naval, air, and logistics base that's roughly equidistant from East Africa, the Middle East, Central and South Asia, and Southeast and East Asia. More than 1/3 of the world's bulk cargo and more than 2/3 of the world's oil shipments will transit through the Indian Ocean on a daily basis. And so, America's placement of a military base on Diego Garcia has been extremely geopolitically important for decades now. It's primarily used as a logistical support site for American warships and aircraft transiting through the Indian Ocean between America's other bases in the Middle East and East Asia, and also as one of America's most important strategic bomber bases. It's home to around 4,000 American military and Department of Defense employees at any given time, and the base is home to several of America's most prized strategic bombers, including the B-52, the B-1, and B-2 stealth bombers. At some times, Diego Garcia has seen the highest concentration of B-2 bombers of any bases in the world that are stored within specialized climate-controlled hangars there. Back in 2020, the U.S. Air Force deployed 3 B-2 stealth bombers from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri all the way to nearly the other side of the world at Diego Garcia on a 29-hour flight. There are only 19 B-2 bombers that exist in the entire world. And at a 2023 inflation-adjusted cost of $4 billion per bomber, America's deployment of 3 of them to Diego Garcia represented more than $12 billion worth of B-2 bombers stationed there, in addition to the billions of dollars worth of B-1 and B-52 strategic bombers and all of their munitions as well. All 3 of these bomber variants are capable of carrying nuclear weapons on board them as well, and their central location based on Diego Garcia enables them to rapidly sortie out armed with either nuclear or conventional munitions and attack threats that might arise anywhere around the Indian Ocean's rim from Africa to the Middle East to Asia, where there have been no shortage of potential strategic threats to the United States recently. Strategic bombers from Diego Garcia have taken off to strike targets across Kuwait and Iraq in the 1991 Gulf War, Al-Qaeda and Taliban targets across Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks, and against Iraqi targets again after the 2003 invasion of the country. And in 2001, Diego Garcia proved its worth to the US military by becoming the linchpin in America's ability to carry out what is, to this date, the longest bombing run in all of recorded history. One day after the United States initiated Operation Enduring Freedom and invaded Afghanistan to topple the Taliban, a B-2 stealth bomber named the Spirit of America took off from its headquarters at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. It flew 4 hours west across the country, where it met up with the first round of aerial refuelers just off the coast of California. Then it continued flying another 4 hours across the Pacific until it rendezvoused with a second round of aerial refuelers that loaded it up over Hawaii. Then it kept on continuing to fly across the Pacific until it rendezvoused with a third round of aerial refuelers that loaded it up again when it reached Guam, a US territory. And then it still just kept on flying until it met up with a fourth round of aerial refuelers that took off from America's base in Singapore to fuel the bomber up over the Strait of Malacca. Then it still just kept on flying until it reached near Diego Garcia in the middle of the Indian Ocean, where a fifth round of aerial refuelers took off to load it completely full of fuel once again. Then, about a day after they took off without ever landing once, the Spirit of America flew straight to Afghanistan where it dropped its bombs across multiple Taliban and Al-Qaeda targets in the country, before it flew back to actually land at America's base on Diego Garcia, having spent a grand total of more than 44 hours continually flying in the air without landing once, and bombing targets on the complete other end of the world. All thanks to the US military's global logistics system and the bomber base on Diego Garcia. And on top of the bombers based on the island, Diego Garcia has enough stockpiles of weapons, munitions, fuel, and other supplies, with enough support ships based there to arm and equip an expeditionary force of up to 16,000 Marines that can be rapidly deployed to anywhere around the Indian Ocean's shoreline and be supported for up to 30 days of full combat operations without receiving any resupplies from the rest of America's military infrastructure all around the world, which greatly enhances America's ability and willingness to quickly respond to threats around the world. And located thousands of kilometers away from any potential enemies across the vastness of the Indian Ocean, those potential enemies will struggle with actually responding to the American presence on Diego Garcia and doing anything about America's ability to coordinate logistics and attacks from it. Moreover, Diego Garcia is located only about 2,200 kilometers away from the Malacca Strait, the narrow maritime choke point through which the majority of China's oil and gas supplies transit through on their way from the Persian Gulf. Operating in tandem with America's major Pacific strategic bomber base on the island of Guam, American bombers taking off from Guam and Diego Garcia can remain out of range of most of China's anti-air systems and could relentlessly attack the Chinese Navy's ships, trying to break out from beyond the first island chain into the Indo-Pacific, and obliterate strategic Chinese maritime imports of fuel. Diego Garcia and Guam therefore work in tandem as America's 2 most secure, unsinkable aircraft carriers in the Indo-Pacific theater. This cements Washington's strategic control over the 2 oceans. But, unlike Guam, Diego Garcia isn't actually located on sovereign American soil. It's theoretically a US overseas military base that's located within the British Indian Ocean Territory, that's there under the permission of the UK government. Similarly to other overseas bases like Guantanamo Bay, the US leases the land of Diego Garcia from the British government rather than owning it outright themselves. But the British ownership of the island is itself a hotly contested issue that's been running on for decades, because Diego Garcia and the rest of the Chagos archipelago is also claimed by the small island nation of Mauritius, located about 2,100 kilometers across the ocean. The issue here dates back to the 1960s, when Mauritius, then a British colony, was being prepared to be released by London as an independent nation during the era of decolonization. Mauritius had been a British colony for a century and a half ever since 1810. And for all of that time, the remote and largely insignificant Chagos archipelago was legally administered as a part of Mauritius. But as the UK was preparing to release Mauritius as an independent country in the early 1960s, the US government recognized Diego Garcia's potential to become Washington's unsinkable aircraft carrier and logistics base in the center of the Indian Ocean. And so, just before granting Mauritius its independence, the British carved out the Chagos archipelago from the rest of the Mauritius colony and established the newly created British Indian Ocean Territory over the islands instead in 1965, the most recently created British colony. 3 years later, Mauritius was granted its independence from Britain without the Chagos archipelago, which had been blatantly separated from Mauritius by Britain in open violation of the UN's Resolution 1514 that was adopted in 1960, which explicitly forbids colonizing countries from dividing their colonies' territories up before granting them their independence. Nonetheless, the US encouraged the British government to keep the Chagos archipelago so that London could lease the island of Diego Garcia to the United States so they could build their military base. And then Washington sweetened the deal even further by offering the UK discounted prices on purchases of American nuclear weapons. Most controversially of all, however, was that the US requested that Diego Garcia be handed over to them for their base construction free of people or inhabitants, so as to maintain the base's secrecy and reserve it for only authorized military personnel. Then, believing that the US might eventually want to lease other islands in the Chagos archipelago for future military bases beyond Diego Garcia, the British government decided upon a policy of forcefully expelling the entire indigenous population of the islands known as the Chagosians. Around 2,000 Chagosian people were rounded up by the British in the early 1970s and exiled from their homeland, largely to Mauritius and the Seychelles, without any compensation or further assistance offered, where they and their descendants have largely remained in desperate poverty ever since. And in order for the UK to not have to report to the UN about its continued colonial rule in the Chagos archipelago, the British government falsely declared to the UN at the time that the Chagos archipelago had no permanent inhabitants, which was theoretically true after thousands of them were forcefully expelled. Shortly afterward, the US military's construction of their massive base on the depopulated Diego Garcia began, and the Chagos archipelago has ever since been widely regarded as Britain's final remaining colony in Africa that was never actually properly decolonized, with the plight of the exiled Chagosian people becoming a largely forgotten but unresolved colonial crime that continues to this day. The British government has repeatedly rejected the right of the Chagosian people and their descendants to ever return back to the islands, citing security concerns around America's vast and secretive military base on the island, and the cost that would be associated with repatriating thousands of people back. For its part, Mauritius has continually ever since its independence claimed the Chagos archipelago and Diego Garcia, arguing that it was coerced and pressured by the colonial-era British government into giving the islands up in the 1960s. In 2017, the matter of sovereignty over the Chagos Islands and Diego Garcia was sent to the International Court of Justice, who 2 years later in 2019 found in a landmark ruling that the UK had indeed illegally separated Chagos from Mauritius back in 1965 against international law, that Britain's decolonization of Mauritius had never been fully completed, and that the territory of the British Indian Ocean Territory should be returned back to Mauritius as quickly as possible. The following year in 2020, the UN General Assembly accepted the International Court of Justice's findings and demanded that the UK withdraw its colonial administration from Chagos within the next 6 months, and the UN began officially marking the Chagos archipelago as belonging to Mauritius in their official maps. But to date, the UK has ignored and rejected all of these demands, while the US has remained as silent as possible on it. benefiting tremendously from their base that they apparently would rather lease from the reliable UK government than the possibly unpredictable Mauritius government who could, maybe one day, tell them to pack up and leave, which would erode a huge part of America's growing Indo-Pacific strategy. Without Diego Garcia, America's military presence in the Indian Ocean theater and its ability to sustain operations around it would be massively diminished. Part of the holdup is the question on whether or not the US maintains an arsenal of nuclear weapons on Diego Garcia. The US government has never confirmed nor denied the presence of nuclear weapons storage on the island. But all of the strategic bombers that America keeps present on the island are well known to be capable of carrying nuclear warheads, which suggests that America probably does keep nuclear weapons there. The problem with this is that back in 1996, every single country in Africa agreed to and signed the Treaty of Pelindaba, which established the entire African continent as a giant nuclear weapons-free zone where nuclear arms would be explicitly and permanently forbidden. This agreement naturally included Mauritius, and according to the Pelindaba Treaty, which views the Chagos Archipelago as a part of Mauritius, the Africa Nuclear Weapons-Free Zone would extend to cover the whole Chagos Archipelago as well, including Diego Garcia. This means that if Mauritius ever regained control of Diego Garcia, even if they allowed the US military base to remain there, they would likely be bound by the 1996 Pelindaba Treaty to restrict the US from storing nuclear weapons on the island. During recent sovereignty negotiations, Mauritius has insisted that they would offer the United States a 99-year lease to Diego Garcia so that they could continue running the strategically important base there. But the US countered that they would only accept that if Mauritius supported the quote, unhindered operation of the base by America, essentially implying without saying it that America would only agree to that if they were allowed to maintain nuclear weapons on the island. And since the British probably let them do it without any fuss, the Americans just prefer to side with the British over the island's sovereignty dispute, even though that opinion is against virtually the entire international consensus and makes London and Washington both appear to be hyper-hypocritical when it comes to condemning the actions of other states doing similar things like Russia and Ukraine. And then, in 2023, it got even worse for them when Human Rights Watch concluded in a landmark report that the UK and US expulsion of the thousands of indigenous Chagosians from the islands in the 1970s constituted crimes against humanity. The first time that the organization has ever levied those high charges against the governments of London or Washington. But the US is also worried that if they ever allowed the Chagosians and their descendants to return to Diego Garcia, there could be thousands of civilians on the island where presently no civilians at all are ever allowed to enter. Diego Garcia is among America's most secretive military bases because it's isolated in the middle of nowhere, and anyone who enters it has to be either a military or a Department of Defense employee with explicit authorization to enter from the base's commander. It's so restrictive that not even military or Department of Defense personnel can bring their spouses or family members to the base with them. They all have to come alone and unaccompanied. With the presumption that the US secretly maintains an arsenal of nuclear weapons on the island, and widespread accusations that the remote island provided the perfect remote location for CIA black sites during the War on Terror, the US government probably has good reasons to keep as many potential eyes away from the base as possible, even if it means doubling down on refusing to allow the Chagosians to return and perpetuating a colonial crime that taints the United States with the charge of crimes against humanity. And that's why out of all of America's hundreds of overseas military bases, Diego Garcia is almost certainly its most controversial. All of America's bases put together serve the ultimate purpose of maintaining the US military's unchallenged ability to strike at anyone, anywhere in the world within only a moment's notice. But many of America's military bases serve ulterior purposes as well, such as serving as discrete locations for CIA black sites and isolated prisons for America's captured enemies to be held far away from the world's prying eyes. And throughout the 2000s and up to the present day, they have been used extensively to isolate and hold members of one of America's most infamous historical enemies, Al-Qaeda. As mentioned previously, many of Al-Qaeda's most infamous members are still being held by the US military in the Guantanamo Bay base in Cuba, and many of them beforehand were likely filtered through other US bases like Diego Garcia and the various European bases, while America's multitude of bases in the Middle East, Asia, and Europe enabled the American war machine to begin rapidly attacking Afghanistan within only weeks of the 9/11 attack taking place, a logistical feat that would have been impossible without them. But America's war with Al-Qaeda didn't start on September 11, 2001 with the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. In fact, America's war with Al-Qaeda began more than a decade before those attacks even took place, back when Al-Qaeda was originally founded by Osama bin Laden and others in the late 1980s. More than a decade worth of conflict and suspicion took place between Al-Qaeda and the United States in between then and the attacks on September 11. Context that is vital to understanding how and why the 9/11 attacks took place, and how America's military bases and infrastructure around the world were radically retooled and transformed after the end of the Cold War to wage the new 21st century global war on terror, the ramifications of which we're still dealing with today. But unfortunately, due to the inherently violent, controversial, and still very recent nature of discussing how an organization as infamous as Al-Qaeda came to be and what exactly they did around the world between the 1980s and the 9/11 attacks, the next part of this video that would cover all of that would almost certainly cause the rest of the video to become demonetized and age-restricted, which ultimately would mean the YouTube's algorithm would have never promoted any of this video to you, and you probably never would have seen any of it. But thankfully, I was still able to produce the next part of this video anyway in my ongoing Modern Conflict series because of the power of this video sponsor, Nebula, where you can go and watch the next 40-minute part covering all of Al-Qaeda's origins and how the organization waged its war against the United States for years before and leading up to the eventual 9/11 attacks. It is critical context to understanding how the attacks eventually took place and how our modern world full of American security infrastructure evolved into its current state. And this is also just one of 36 full-length real-life lore videos that you can only find on Nebula in my overall Modern Conflict series. They can all only be found over there because of all of their darker, more controversial subject material. There's other episodes you can go and watch right now covering other relevant topics from this video, like the rise and fall of ISIS and how the United States utilized its overseas bases to crush them. An episode covering America's decades-long war in Afghanistan. Another episode covering the 2003 US invasion of Iraq. And other videos covering the US interventions in the civil wars in Syria and Libya, and many, many others, with brand new episodes releasing over there every single month. And even better, I also recently started another completely new monthly series on Nebula called War Room, which will track all of the latest breaking geopolitical news developing from conflicts all around the world, and break them down into a single, easily digestible monthly video briefing series that'll help you stay even more up to date and informed on what's currently happening around the world and why. The latest episode in War Room, covering all of the breaking geopolitical news and developments from last month in June, is live on Nebula for you to go and watch right now. And new episodes will be released every month, just like the monthly new episodes in Modern Conflicts have been, meaning 2 new exclusive real-life lore videos on Nebula that you won't find on YouTube going out every single month going forward. And what's even more, you also get access to all of the other amazing exclusive content that's on Nebula, because the best part about this site is that it's jointly co-owned by all of its creators, built by myself and hundreds of other independent YouTubers and podcasters. And because it's a subscription-based service, we all get to work on way bigger and higher budget productions over there than we could ever do on YouTube. That's why there's tons of other exclusive content you'll find equally fascinating from all of these other creators over there that you probably also already know as well. And right now, Nebula is also selling lifetime memberships that'll last for as long as both you and Nebula exist. Lifetime memberships cost $300 and they'll last you forever. There's no tricks or gimmicks, you just pay once and you'll have access to everything that will ever exist on Nebula forever. That way, you can avoid paying a recurring monthly subscription, and the capital we're raising from lifetime subscriptions are being all reinvested into even more new content on the site to expand our even more ambitious projects of movies, plays, shows, and documentaries that are all soon to come, and that I'm very excited about. And best of all, if you'd rather sign up for an annual or monthly plan in Nebula, that's fine too. And you can sign up for one by clicking the button that's here on your screen right now, or by following the link down below in the description, or by scanning the QR code here on your screen. Any of which will give you an insanely good 40% discount off of an annual subscription, which means it'll only cost you $250 a month for all of this awesome exclusive content from myself and hundreds of other independent creators. It's the absolute best way to help support what I'm doing here on Real Life Lore, and as always, thank you so much for watching.